Good evening once again. My name is Ashish Pandey. I teach in the School of Management here, and this is my privilege to introduce Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, who is going to present Institute Colloquium now. Uh, Mr. Sanyal represent the if we have to look at the icon of the modern India of Bharat, modern Bharat, contemporary Bharat, uh, one of the persons we can suddenly have kind of embodying some of the values is Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. He has been a very successful banker before leading the strategy group of a multinational bank before joining government. And currently, he is a member of the Economic Advisory Council to Prime Minister of India. He has helped prepare 6 editions of Economic Survey of India and has represented India at G7 and OECD meetings. He has been behind many of the administrative and financial reforms about which he is going to talk about in a little more detail. In his academic role, he is Chancellor of Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, and we all know that Mr. Sanyal has been author of some of the very, very popular and uniquely conceived and thought through books in history as well as the economic history. We also know him as a great author and a scholar who brought the importance and role of revolutionaries in the Indian freedom struggle. So, in a way, a polymath and deep from heart, anchored in the Indian cultural values. This is my privilege and honor to invite Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal to present the Institute Colloquium on this day. Mr. Sanyal.
Good afternoon, everyone. And let me say a big thank you to IIT Bombay for hosting me here today, and to all of you for making time to listen to me today on a topic of which, as I hope I will convince you, we are doing quite a lot of interesting things in India. And I hope I can convince you that these things are making India a much better place as part of our road to Viksit Bharat. So, the topic I've chosen to speak about is about the issue of process reforms. Now, why am I going to talk about this? Well, partly because I've spent the last few years doing these process reforms, but also partly because thanks to Elon Musk's Doge, these have become very topical. Nobody cared about them till very, very recently. I literally would not have been able to interest anybody in this subject. But these days, a lot of people want to know about these kinds of reforms. So I'm going to talk to you about a bunch of reforms that we have been doing for the last 3-4 years that I have been personally involved in. I'm going to specifically pick up reforms that I have worked on because I can give you the details on them in ways that I couldn't on ones I haven't done. But that is not to say that other parts of the government also are not doing these kinds of reforms. So the question first arises, what on earth are process reforms in the first place? Now, there are of course many, many kinds of reforms, but the reforms that you mostly will hear about usually will be something called structural reform. Whenever you hear in the newspapers economic reforms are being done, you'll hear structural reform. And it is so commonly used that many people may take the impression that that is the only kind of reforms there are. But in fact, structural reforms relate to reforms that effectively change the structure of some activity. So the original 1991 reforms was a structural reform. It changed the structure of our economy from being a socialist system to a market-driven system. More recently, we did structural reforms like GST. That's a change in the way indirect taxes functions in this country. Or we did the inflation targeting framework that changes the structure in which we run monetary policy. There is also the insolvency and bankruptcy code, which changes the way creative destruction happens in India. So all of those were structural reforms. These are the reforms that end up in the newspaper headlines because they tend to be cool, big reforms. But there is another kind of reforms called process reforms, which very often don't get the same kind of headlines because they are basically nuts and bolts reforms. Small rule number 43B, subsection D, some 2 words have been changed. Now, this kind of reform is also reform. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands of them that need to be done. And hopefully, as I will convince you, that these reforms are just as important. Sometimes they're important cumulatively because lots of them get done. Sometimes even individual and small tweaks can have massive non-linear improvements in the quality of whatever activity that we are dealing with. And in the last several years, last 3-4 years particularly, we have actually done hundreds of these kinds of reforms. And I'm just going to talk to you a bunch of them. And here is one complaint about the academic community. And in that, for whatever reason, there is almost no literature on process reforms globally. You will occasionally get a case study from some management school on some process reform, but you will almost not hear about process reforms as a type of reform. And therefore, I have taken it upon myself to both document and write about this category of reform. However, there are so few people who work on this field that if you just Google process reform, the first 10-15 hits will be all with my name. I'm not saying process reforms in India, just process reform globally. Now, this is very odd because business process reform and business process engineering is a huge area of work. Anybody who studied in any MBA type course will probably almost certainly have been subjected to business process engineering. But nobody seems to care about government process engineering, when in fact it's quite obvious to everybody the government needs lots of process engineering. So as I said, sir, if your public policy school does this, please get them to look at this. There are huge gains from this. So, how does one go about doing these process reforms? Well, what I have done is taken the literature from business process engineering and simply reformatted it for my purpose. So, the first thing to do obviously is to identify an area where you need reform. Then you need to do a mapping, which is an as-is mapping of what exists. Whatever it is that exists today, just map it. Okay. After that, you need to identify the exact issues that they are there. Now, my own experience with doing this is that you will discover most of the time that 80 to 90% of the problem lies in 20 to 10% of the process. Now, this is very important because most of the time you can actually make a relatively small change and the entire system begins to work. This is commonly understood as the Pareto principle for those of you who study in business process or re-engineering, but it is in fact even more true of government because not only will you get your own little process moving, very often it declogs many other things in the larger system. Of course, you then need to carry out those reforms, having identified them. So, how do you do those reforms? What exactly do you need to do? Rule change, law change, what do you need to do? And then you need to do one more thing, which is important in government more than perhaps it is in the private sector, which is you need to monitor the new process and see whether or not that whatever it is that you were trying to change actually happened. 2, that it did not have unintended consequences somewhere else in the system. This last step is important for 2 reasons. One is because you're dealing with very large government, which is much larger than the typical company. So the chance of there being unintended consequences, both positive and negative. So sometimes the unintended consequences can be actually a good thing. Both of them you need to document and look at. The other is, of course, because of the bureaucratic nature of what we are trying to do, very often the change is made and then nobody bothers to find out whether or not actually something happened, as a result of which very often you need to do a few more iterations, which does not naturally happen in government, which may happen in much more easily in a corporate. So the last step is an important step disproportionately in a government system. So what are the kinds of process reforms I'm going to talk about? The obvious type one is revisiting default lists and precedents. Second type, streamlining of existing administrative processes. Third, changes in regulations within the given law. Third, changes in the legislation and changing the law. So the first one is just changing the regulation within a law, but sometimes you have to change the law itself. Then adding some capacity and level of government to remove a bottleneck, removing a requirement of some state mandated activity, and then finally, type 7, merge, close, or restructure outdated government agencies. All these are types. I'm going to give you examples of each one of them. Now, the first and simplest kind of reform that you need to do in governments in particular, but it's true of any large system, is simply revisiting default lists. You will be surprised the extent to which any large system basically does some default thing. It's too complicated. Mostly the individuals in the system are doing some little nook and cranny. The senior guys are too tired and busy. So various things function on autopilot because of some list. So it may be a list of invitees to some your annual events. So for example, you go to any embassy in Delhi, this is particularly true. One of the funny things is you go to some of these embassies, not the big ones that are still more active, but you go to some of the mid-level countries, which are still large countries and they have big events, and you will suddenly bump into people, who were famous 30 years ago and you have not heard of them ever since, but they are there in that party because some 30 years ago, the ambassador at that time had put that guy's name in the list, and wahi log aa rahe hain tab se. Now, one of such lists that is there in the Indian government is the list of monuments of national importance. Now, India has 3,695 monuments of national importance. Now, these are those monuments that are there under the AMSAR Act, looked after by Archaeological Survey of India. And many of you will remember when you go to an archaeological site, there will very often be a blue board which threatens you with dire consequences if even you breathe hard next to the building. Now, those monuments, how did they end up in the list? Now, it turns out that the vast majority of them were essentially either a part of the list we inherited from the British. So at the time of independence, the British had a list of national monuments, so we ended up with them. Or we got them from the princely states, which is also pre-independence. A few hundred have been added since then. But the vast majority of them basically were the national monuments we happened to inherit. And in the last 77 years, we did not bother to go and relook and see whether those monuments should be in the list or not. The result of this is there are several dozen national monuments that the Archaeological Survey does not even know where they are. They are actually missing. And they didn't go missing yesterday. They went missing in the, at least in the 1970s. So there are parliamentary questions where the Archaeological Survey have been asked, do you know about these missing monuments? And the Archaeological Survey has said, we have no clue. Then there are a whole bunch of other garbage as well. Okay, there are colonial era graves of obscure PWD engineers and so on. So Nagaland, for example, has 3 national monuments. 2 of them are essentially the graves of some official that some local Nagas 100 years ago had killed. They're nothing even of archaeological aesthetic importance. They're like a small grave the size of this podium. That's all there is to it. And yet it's a national monument. All the rules, it is 100 meters plus 200 meter radius that is protected, applies to this grave as well. And if you happen to live near it and you want to make some change in your hut or whatever it is, you have to go and ask the ASI official for a no objection certificate. which, as you can imagine, is the source of a lot of harassment, rent seeking, and other things. So I began to look at this list about 3 years ago. I think it was So in 2022, I began to look at it. I came up with a report on the absurdity of much of this. And I'm going to illustrate the sheer absurdity of this thing with the story of the statue of John Nicholson. Now, John Nicholson was a British brigadier general who had carried out the sacking of Delhi in 1858. So after the Great Revolt, he had sacked Delhi. Even by the standards of that time, he was considered to be an absolutely brutal nutcase. He had carried out large numbers of massacred large numbers of people. And of course, the very grateful British colonial government then raised a statue to him in front of Kashmiri Gate and listed it as a national monument. He then died, and he had a grave set up, also not far from Kashmiri Gate, which is still also a national monument. So both of these, his statue and his grave, was inherited as a national monument by the Indian Republic at the time of independence. Okay. Now, somewhere in the 1960s, his birth village in Northern Ireland asked for his statue. So we packed it up and sent it to Northern Ireland, where it was put up. And once a year, they put Phul Mala, whatever else they do, and they celebrate John Nicholson. That's their problem. The problem is, in India, we did not delist it from the list of national monuments. So it continued to be a national monument, even though it didn't exist in India. And the spot in which it stood once continued to apply a 300-meter radius rules under the Amsar Act. In Kashmiri Gate, which is one of the most densely populated places in the country, with lots of buildings, etc., and anybody who wanted to change anything inside their building had to go and get permission from ASI. Now think about the sheer absurdity of this. Not only that, his grave, as you can see, is also a national monument. This is the grave, and you can see that it has got the famous blue board threatening you with dire consequences if you did anything to that grave. Now just imagine this. Your tax dollars, tax rupees are being used to protect this grave. It is clearly of no archaeological significance. And this entire area, 300 meters, and there are buildings on either side, etc., you cannot make any changes. If one of you died and happens to be Christian and wants to be buried here, you can't be buried in your own country because some Brit chap has got buried there. Now you cannot use this anymore. Now, the good news is, finally, we are beginning to do some work on this. In July last year, finally, after I wrote several times in the newspapers and petitioned, etc., the grave and the cemetery of John Nicholson have now been delisted as national monuments. We are in the process of doing several hundred more of these kinds of changes. So this is an example of changing, doing a small process reform. You may think it's very, very small, but in fact, for the lives of hundreds of people who live in areas which are in and around these national monuments, this is a very big deal. Next. Now I'm going to talk about another kind of reform. Here, this is all about administrative streamlining, okay? I'm not going to change the laws. I'm not changing the regulation even. All I'm doing within the given set of rules, I'm just rejigging the process. Now, the example I'm giving is of something called voluntary liquidation of companies. Now, in any country, some 80-90% of companies that are shut down every year are shut down entirely voluntarily. Okay, this is not companies that have gone, bankrupt or any such thing. This is just, some old guy who's running some company. His kids don't want to do the same business. He is just shutting it down. Or there is a company that set up a subsidiary. That subsidiary is not needed for some reason. He wants to shut it down. So entirely voluntarily, we shut down companies all the time. Some 80% of companies or more shut down every year are shut down for this reason. And in India, there are two ways of doing it. One is the Section 248 of Companies Act 2013 and the Section 59 of IBC. For the purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to talk about Section 249 of Companies Act because the bulk of it goes through that, and I'll just stick with that. Now, what used to happen for anybody? Has anybody here attempted to shut down a company? Here is somebody who has. Fine, let me tell you. Yeah, so he has been struggling for 15 years to shut down a company. Well, his case is particularly bad, but it used to take several years even for the average Joe. Now, this is when there is no objection to shutting it down. Okay, it's not that there's some disgruntled employee or a court case, income tax. Nobody is objecting to shutting it down, and yet you cannot shut it down. So we went and looked into the process, and what did we discover? So remember, what you have to do, you have to map the process. And we discovered that you were supposed to get no objection certificates from a whole bunch of people, labor, tax, of various kinds, etc., etc. And once you had got those no objection certificates, you were supposed to, for some reason, which was not specified anywhere, you were supposed to get it in a certain sequence. Once you had got it in that certain sequence, you then had to take it to the registrar of companies who was supposed to put out an ad, which is fine. You want to proclaim that company is being shut down. People should know in case there is some liability, because once a company is shut down, it extinguishes it as an economic person. So so therefore it's important to advertise it. But for some reason, again, even after you got all the NOCs and you sent it to the registrar of companies, they would take months, if not years, to actually put up the advertisement. And you eventually had to bribe somebody to do it. So when I was making this presentation and doing this reform to the finance minister, I made this presentation when I was still in the finance ministry to Nirmala ji. I had also, for her presentation, also managed to get the rate card of the bribes from the registrar of companies of how big a company needs to bribe how much for shutting themselves, putting up the ad for shutting down. So anyway, the matter was taken seriously. And so what did we do? What we did is we created a website called CPACE. Please, sir, you should look it up. Okay? Why? I'll tell you. In CPACE, once you load all the details, the system itself sends emails or messages to all the people who are supposed to give the NOCs simultaneously. There is no reason why this should be done sequentially. It can be done simultaneously. And after 21 days, if nobody objects, which is 99% of the time, what happens is the system itself sends a list to the registrar of companies to put out the ad. They don't have too much of a choice in doing this unless they themselves put up an objection. But that requires them to also do some work. So now, what has happened as a result of this, we have been running it since May 2023, and look at the average number of days for shutting down companies, what has happened. The average number used to take about 500 days. It dropped to 199, then to 90, and then now to 60 days. The average time to shut down a company is now 60 days. So please use CPACE and definitely do not listen to your CA. This works, and this is the average. We don't think we can be very much faster than this because you do have to have some time lags, etc. But at this level, we are by some margin the fastest country for doing this company shutdown in the world.
Section 8 companies. The one I'm speaking is Section 8 companies.
For that, I have to still do the processes. So, Section 8 I haven't done. These are for normal companies. By the way, I have to do it for societies as well. Yeah, I haven't done it yet. But on the way. Okay. Now, changes in regulation. So here, it's not good enough to just change the process or list to something. I actually have to change a regulation. So I'm going to give you an example. By the way, Mastic, is it in the BPO industry as well? Oh, good. So now you will recognize some of the things here.
I am involved in founding of NESCOM.
Good. So I will tell you about a reform that I did in the middle of COVID, which has had major things. Did you know about the famous OSP regulations?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. So this is a regulation called the Revised Terms and Conditions, Other Service Providers 2008. Now, you could not have a more sarkari sounding regulation in the world. And this was a regulation of the telecom department, which basically said that anybody using a telecom system, and literally didn't define what an other service provider is, it could be pretty much anybody using a telecom system to do any work had to actually get a permission from the telecom department, case by case, location by location, in order to use it for business. Okay, so technically, anybody even doing work from home on their laptop was actually illegal till this rule was changed in 2020. Okay. Now, of course, the telecom department was clever enough not to deal with individuals, but what they used to do is to go to IT-enabled or BPO type businesses and essentially demand hafta for allowing them permission to use the telecom system for doing business using the telecom system. And some of it was really absurd. First of all, as I said, there was no clear definition of what an other service provider is. Pretty much anybody could be. Then it had all these bizarre requirements. For example, it insisted that you had to have an EPA BX machine in your basement. Why? The 28-year-olds who did this research for me, they are now 32, but at that time they were 28. They had no idea what on earth an EPA BX machine was. Then they required special registration for each OSP location. So even if telecom ministry said that, okay, you are good, etc., every location you had to go have, extremely specifically had to be registered. So even if you managed to register your home, if you went from bedroom to the bathroom with your laptop, you were being illegal. Then there were even more bizarre things. They did not allow infrastructure sharing between domestic and international OSPs. Now let me show you how absurd this is. Let's say you are Singapore Airlines. You have an Indian national, buys a ticket in Singapore and comes to India and then has a problem in Mumbai. Now he calls up for some help to the Singapore Airlines BPO. Okay, is he an international or is he a domestic traveler? Who knows? More importantly, who cares? Surely the whole point about this whole thing is the ability to create economies of scale, and yet this was not allowed according to this OSP rule. So the question that arises, how on earth did I discover this? So I discovered it because in March of 2020, when we did a lockdown, the next day the telecom ministry came up with a notification which said that these OSP regulations would not apply till December 2020. In other words, so that in order to allow people to work from home. Now, I'm a suspicious sort of chap. Moment I read this, I realized the telecom ministry was not actually giving you people a choot to do whatever they wanted. What they were really doing was signaling that, guys, for now we are letting you off, but do remember that in December 2020, this thing is going to come back on. So actually it was a threat. It was actually not a exemption. So having discovered it, I then began to dig into this. And so we did one set of reforms in November 2020 and then further in 2021. The result of which is that we ended up with after much negotiating, fighting, screaming, etc., I managed to extract this from the telecom ministry officials, which is, there is now a clear definition of OSPs. It is defined only for voice and not for any other thing. And now 90% of everything is done with data. So frankly, the whole thing is actually irrelevant. But even if you did it by voice, it allows for interconnectivity between there's no distinction between domestic and international. There's no distinction in home and remote. You don't need an OSP. You can use the cloud and everything. Basically, this law has now become irrelevant. and look at the immediate benefits from this. A study done in December 2021 noted that 92% of people in the IT and BPO sector found that their compliance burden went down. So imagine the benefit from it. 92% of companies in that sector benefit from this, and 28% of them noted that 50% of the compliance burden came off. So can you imagine what a huge friction this was to the system? So one of the lessons of all of this is, if you ever become a government official, do not put out unnecessary notifications that the Prime Minister's Economic Council may come across. Now I'm going to take you into another level of change, which is legislative changes. Now this is where you actually have to go to the legislation. You have to change the law. And I'm giving here an example of something which I have not yet won the war. Okay, so that you are aware that not everything I've done has succeeded yet. So okay? How many of you know what legal metrology is? Let me see. How many people in this room knows what legal metrology even is? Okay. Legal metrology are the laws that are related to weights, measures, and labels. Okay? Every country in the world has these. But legal metrology is the source. These laws that I will describe are the source of the second largest amount of small-time bribe taking in our country. The largest, of course, is traffic. This is the second largest. So why does this happen? So basically what is the Legal Metrology Acts and the Label Acts as well, which are its cousins, they basically it's set up in such a way that even for small infractions, you can end up in jail. And it is set up in a particular way, peculiar way. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That the first time if you make an error, and it doesn't matter how big the error is, okay, it could be that your label that you have is in the wrong font. You have to give a small fine. It could be just a couple of thousand rupees. But if the second time, you may end up in jail for as much as 7 years. So look at what happens as a result of this. These are the numbers I had. I think I should update these. But anyway, you can see that the first offense as a result runs somewhere in the range of 1 lakh of them. But the second offense, as you can see, only happens in 12, 5, 3, 11. Now the legal metrology departments love to show this data and claim that, look, this is such a fantastic job we are doing. Once somebody has done an error, he never does it again. But in fact, that's not what is happening. All that is happening is that the legal metrology guys try to phasao you for some small infraction. Once you have done it, you are their slaves for life. Because for the second infraction, you can be sent to jail for many years. So you can imagine 1 lakh minus 12 is the number of clients that they have managed to get. And this is half the collection functions. So of course, they have no incentive at all of sending anybody to actually fight the second case. Now, I began to fight this battle and so managed to change some of the rules, and some of them were there. And I made a list of them and gave them, and under the Jan Vishwas Bill 2022, a lot of them were decriminalized. However, I lost the battle for 3 sections, section 30, 33 and 36. And you may wonder why. The reason is that those are the ones that account for 80% of the cases. So you can see what bureaucracy does. They basically protected the bits that unke matlab ka tha. I'm fighting this battle still, but I'm just trying to give you a sense of the kinds of battles that happen. However, I have managed to make a small victory on the side meanwhile in the same space, which didn't require legal change. I managed to do it through regulation. That at least for labels, one of the things that used to happen is that random changes used to happen at any time. Now, note that this is a real problem because you see labels are printed in large batches. Now just imagine I have printed a large batch. The next day, some font change has happened. Now, and those laws, you saw how they are. I have to essentially trash the whole lot. Or even worse, I have somehow sent it into the supply chain, and then I have to go and drag it out through pull it out through the supply chain, otherwise you will catch me. So now a new change has come from at least the food guys, FSSAI, saying that all changes every year will be announced only once, on the 1st of July. Now everybody who is in the labeling business knows this. They will keep themselves light just ahead of this, and all the changes will happen. Now remember, there's no loss to anybody from this. Everybody benefits. It's not an ideological debate. Massive efficiency gains. So the reason I'm telling you this is that many of these changes have huge efficiency gains, even though they are very, very small reforms. Now I'm going to talk to you about, so far I have been trying to get rid of bureaucracy and various things, but sometimes we actually have to add state capacity somewhere. And I'm going to use here the example of the intellectual property rights space, particularly the Patents Office. Now, if we went back to 2015, just look at how we used to do patents. In 2015, a country our size only had 46,000 filings, and we only gave out 6,326 grants. Now just think about this. 10 years ago, this is just 10 years ago, we were giving out only 6,000 grants a year. And we were doing 46,000 or about 47,000 filings a year. So first of all, your chances of getting your grant was low. They were delayed by years. And this is technology. If you haven't got the grant, somebody else has got it and carried on, you have lost the game. So this was terrible. And this was at a time when the United States was doing already about 3 lakh patents. China was doing more than 3.5 lakh patents. How can you place this game? You just can't. This is not a game you're going to win. Now, since then, by 2023, I have got the data, the number of grants in China went up to, look at it, 9 lakhs. Now, admittedly, about half of it in China is basically garbage, because these are very low-level patents. You call utility patents. But even then, of decent patents, they are doing at least 3 to 4 lakhs. The US is also doing a little over 3 lakhs. But the number of patents we are granting in 2023 also jumped up to 1 lakh. So, although it is still much lower than what the others are doing, we are at least in the game. The question is, how did we go from 6,000 to 1 lakh in a decade? And the way we did it, we discovered, was this problem. See, very often when we think of government, we think of it having too many people. But in fact, our problem was that we, in 15-16, when we were just giving 6,000 patents out, we only had 271 people working in the patent office. Now, to put it in context, the Chinese have 13,000 people in their patent office. The Americans have 8,500. So it's like playing a cricket match in which the other side has 13 players and you don't even have 1 player. You're going to lose. So in the last few years, as you can see, we have been increasing the number of patent officers quite steadily. The number has gone up till last financial year till 833. So that's a very significant increase. But more importantly, we are right now in the process of hiring another 500 people. They have already been hired. They are now being trained. So by the middle of this year, we will have about 1,383 patent officers. So you can see a very significant increase. And we have another 500 odd that are in the pipeline. We have additional hiring over the next 3 years in place. Why is this important? Because we will now have the capacity to process about 2.5 lakh patents. So let me go back and why this is important. You see what the problem is here. Look at the filings. So even though it has gone up very significantly, you see the filings have gone to 92,000. We gave over 1 lakh patents last year. How was I able to do it? Because I had a backlog. Now I have cleared that backlog. Now my problem is this year up to December, I've got 78,000. Let's say I get 1 lakh in this financial year. Okay, so 1 lakh now. Realistically speaking, about 45% odd of these will actually get the patent. So in order to give out 1 lakh patents a year, I need over 2 lakh patents applications. I'm not even doing 1 lakh. So what will happen this year is you can see the grants are going to decline. I have already begun to decline. So I now have a different problem. I have a problem that I have created capacity in the government. Now I'm waiting for the R&D system of this country to actually generate the application. So come on, IIT Bombay. I'm waiting for you. Yeah, you may have complained earlier that the patent office wasn't doing a job. Now you are the problem. Okay. Now I'm going to go to a different area, which is removing a state mandated activity. Okay. This is not something in government, but something the government wants you to do, which may be inefficient. How many of you know what mediation is in legal parlance? 1, 2, there are a few people, 4, 5 people. But basically it's common sense what it is. Legal mediation is essentially a pre-litigation process by which two people with a dispute, rather than immediately go and file a case, they go to a mediator and try and sort it out. Now sounds like a wonderfully sensible thing. We have got an overburdened legal system and it's good to try and have an out-of-court settlement of some sort. Good in theory. The problem is that in 2015, the Commercial Courts Act made it mandatory for all commercial disputes to go through mediation. Okay, now this may again sound sensible, but let me show you why it's a bad idea. Here is the data from 2 commercial courts in Mumbai, where you can look at the number of disposed cases, how many of them were settled, how many of them failed, how many of them are non-starters. Now you can see if you add non-starter and failed cases, 97% of the cases even today, after almost a decade of this process starting, do not get resolved by going through this process. And yet every single case has to go through this process. Even though it fails for 97% of the cases, all it does is that it delays the inevitable by 6 months. You're wasted, you paid lawyer fees, you paid for the mediator, and 97% of the time it does no good. It's obviously a complete waste of time. So I'm now trying to change the law to make this process voluntary again. And if the mediators are so good, people will come to them voluntarily. Why do you want to make this, make it mandatory? The only people who benefit from this are obviously the lawyers, which is why they made it mandatory. In fact, they were trying to do this even for civil cases, but thankfully the standing committee shot it down. Otherwise, any of you, even if you had a fight with your neighbor over the garden hedge, you would have had to go through this process. So I am in the process of, I'm working on an amendment, which is with the law ministry right now. And this is a case that if I do win and this does pass, then you'll know why on earth we bothered to do this. Now I'm going to finally come to the type 8. This is about merging, closing, restructuring outdated government agencies. Now in any large system, I'm 100% sure this must be true of IIT as well. There will be at least a few outdated agencies, departments, autonomous bodies of some sort, which may have had a use at some point, but have outlived their utility. But it's simply impossible to shut it down. There are people there, they have got vested interests, or maybe simply lethargy. Many of these bodies just continue to live on. Now, one of the things I have done over the last few years is to identify a bunch of these and actually shut it down. Again, you can see the parallel here with what Elon Musk is trying to do. Of course, his approach is blitzkrieg. Mine is attrition warfare. And in the course of this, we have shut down quite a few things. The Tariff Commission, the All India Handloom Board, the All India Handicraft Board, the Central Organization of Modernization of Workshops, the Rashtriya Mahila Kosh. There is the Children's Film Society. There were all kinds of other bodies that are there, we have shut down. These are the ones I was involved in, but there are other parts of the government who also shut down, and these government agencies. At the last count, there were something like 850 autonomous bodies of the central government alone. And of course, some of these autonomous bodies do things that are clearly useful. There's SEBI and Reserve Bank of India, etc. But there are a whole bunch of them that nobody really knows what they do. And shutting them down still requires a significant amount of effort. I'll give you one example. There was something called the National Handicraft, All India Handicraft Board. Now, the All India Handicraft Board has existed for a long time. Now, I want to state that when you try to shut something like this down, inevitably the people who run it will say that you are fascist, that you do not care for the artisans and so on. That is not the case. We all love handicrafts. But there are lots of bodies. There's Khadi and this and that. There are many other bodies, Silk Board, etc., etc. And then there are state government entities that are doing handicrafts. Question is not whether we love handicrafts or not. The question is whether the All India Handicraft Board does anything useful. So, in the year 2022, we decided, for a variety of reasons, that this particular board was not doing much work, and we shut it down. Now, this thing used to be under the then Textile Minister, Smriti Iraniji. She shut it down, and inevitably, the person who used to chair it and had chaired it for over 20 years wrote an article in a Mumbai newspaper, again saying that, oh my God, this government is fascist and so on. It doesn't care about artisans and so on and so forth. So that article came out. So it was, somebody tweeted it as well. So Smriti Iraniji then replied to one of those tweets and said, we will be very pleased to re-establish the All India Handicraft Board if one of the members or the chairman can kindly provide us with minutes of any meeting they have held in the last 16 years. We are still waiting. To conclude, there is obviously large structural reforms very often get the headlines. But in fact, much of what we are doing is these small reforms. We have literally removed over 1,000 outdated laws. Many processes like this have been eased. Some of you have benefited from this. For example, the process of getting a passport, for example, has become much smoother than it used to be, and so on and so forth. This does not mean that this job is done. There are literally thousands more to be done. And so we are at it, one step at a time. There is a concerted effort, and now you may have heard that there is going to be a deregulation commission as well. So some of these will be probably taken up by that. But the important thing here is that I've given here examples from India, but its lessons are applicable everywhere. There are various ways of going about doing these kinds of changes. There is the Elon Musk approach, as I mentioned. Our approach is a slower one. There is the Argentinian Millet approach, and so on and so forth. So different countries are doing it in somewhat different ways, but the general idea is the same. And my point here was to come here and talk to you and give you a sense of how we think about these reforms, why they're important, and how they get done. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah.
Some time for questions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And after that, we'll see.
Yeah.
Since you talked about
Give him a phone.
Since you talked about archaeology and specifically about some of the British monuments, which were hardly 200, 300 years old, I wish to tell you about what is happening in certain parts of India, so especially southern India, where the temples are controlled by the state government, and there are gold which are 1,000 years old, 500 years old, and they are just melted or sold in the black market, and little heavier gold is replaced by the so-called philanthropy industrialist, because they make the old gold is 2 or 3 times more valuable than the existing gold.
No, so this is certainly a process
So
reform.
we need a regulator to primarily certify the artifact.
No,
And,
so this is
sir, for example,
so I know this problem.
yes, sir.
This is not a problem, sadly, the central government can solve, because those are almost all state government owned. Although there are some central government owns this thing, but those are not very rich. The really rich ones are all state government owned.
Yes.
Frankly, we don't need a regulator. What we need is to return the temple's control back to the people who it belongs to.
Agree that.
So I don't want regulators. All it will want is you will just get the same civil servants, judges, etc., who are running it today will now sit in the regulator. It's a waste of time. These temples need to be returned to the Hindus.
Sir, why I told this is...
So I don't actually want a regulator.
No, I'm not telling about the regulation, but I would like to come to a point. Planting a red sandalwood 50 years before was illegal, or a sandalwood for many states. But now there is a centralized policy where what the government will play or what the regulator will play, I am okay with that. It should be given to the public, but it should be monitored.
No,
If
you can
don't
monitor it, but my
Yes.
basic premise is
Yes.
that if in doubt, be suspicious of the regulator, not the citizen.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, hi. So the question is related to HR kind of reforms, especially when it comes to government agencies. At least I feel this. There's a lot of inefficiency that comes in from the human resource rather than the technological resource. So how and when?
So this is a very long conversation, but let me say that many experiments have been done. Not all of them have been very successful. So, for example, one experiment I'll give you, which we did do, which was lateral entry. And I'm still in favor of doing some lateral entry, but I do want to tell people that our experience with this has not been particularly stellar. I'm not even getting into the controversy that there was about reservations and quotas, etc. Just bringing in people from outside and putting them in positions apart does not always work, because unless you change the nature of relationship between the government and the citizen, because once you put an outside person on that chair, we have found very often their behavior is just the same, if not sometimes even worse. We have right now, recently, I've been looking at a certain regulator who is from outside, but unbelievable excessive behavior by the regulator, the chairman of this regulator, which even though she's from the private sector. So I don't think we need to get too worked up about it. I think there is need for better HR, etc. But I think we give too much emphasis to it. The bigger problem is the architecture of the nature of the relationship of the Indian citizen with the Indian state. And the Indian state is given way too many powers. Until the state is clearly limited, we will continue to get bad outcomes, because we have not circumscribed what the Indian state is supposed to do. The Indian state's job is to fix the potholes in the road. It is not to go and interfere with people's lives and running temples, for example. And yet we allow it to happen. So I think one thing that we really need to work with as a people, we need to get out of this, sarkar hi hamari mai baap hai attitude. The civil service may or may not be civil, but the first thing is that the civil servant is the servant. And we need to get that into our heads. Unfortunately, we don't yet have that relationship. Maybe it's the result of a long era of colonial and then socialist rule, but we simply give too much power to our civil servants. We just need to circumscribe that very, very significantly. So until we have fixed that, it doesn't matter who you put in the place. If you give those many powers to somebody, once in a while you'll get somebody sensible who knows how to wield the power. Most of the time, you will get misuse of power.
Thank you. So thank you for giving what you said in the beginning might be a boring talk, but it really was really enjoyable. So thank you very much. My name is Anirudh Joshi. I am a I come from the IDC School of Design, and I had a design question for you.
Okay.
So in our world, we look at it as many of the things that the government would do as a service design activity. So is the government considering taking up a service design approach to?
Right now,
those?
no.
Okay.
But why don't you help me?
Yeah, sure.
Take up a one or two good topics and do it. I can even give you some examples. If you can figure out how to improve the experience of an EPFO subscriber, I'll be deeply grateful to you, as will the nation. Or if you can actually figure out how the investor education and protection fund functions when you try to retrieve your shares or inherited shares, and the entire process, if you can re-engineer it, I would be very grateful. Why don't you take up one that is publicly available, where I don't have to go to the ministry and to get you permission. There are plenty of processes that are freely available. Why don't you re-engineer one of them for me and bring them to me? Something that citizens interact with all the time, and show me the process design of it, how it can be sort of how the intellectual ergonomics or the process ergonomics of it can be made better. Just take up one or two and show me, and I'll give it a shot and try to implement them if it works.
Hi, this is Professor Ankur Kulkarni. We met for lunch. I
Yeah.
also serve on the advisory board for SEBI. So one of the questions I had for you was, you mentioned this case of NOCs, where NOCs were being sought in sequence. Now, this is an experience I've had even in IIT and sometimes also in SEBI, is that people don't give NOCs in a clear-cut way. They may give conditional NOCs. And HOD will say, I'm okay if the dean is okay. Dean will say that I'm okay if the HOD is okay. Now, in this kind of a case, what happens is you get into a deadlock because nobody is willing to bell the cat. So is there a way by which one can think through this and
So the way we have
this?
solved this in the case of that case is that it worked the other way. The NOC would come if in 21 days somebody did not actually object. So it was an automatic NOC unless otherwise somebody objected to it. So that's how I have circumvented it here. But there might be another way of doing it for another use case. And this is a very good example of design, process design. So you have somebody right next door to you who might be able to solve it for you. But it's actually a matter of the workflow. And very often, and at least my experience now that I've done several of them, is to convert something, an NOC, into a default. Unless it's something dangerous like nuclear weapons, most of the time that is the more sensible way of doing it. Now, I can understand you don't want to do that with nuclear weapons, but NOCs should be, for a very large number of things, be actually the default. This will be, by the way, true for a very large part of what SEBI does. There will be only a handful of things which SEBI should require you the hard NOC. Otherwise, it should lapse after a certain level of time. Yes. You will never get consensus. All change is done by change makers from the beginning of time. You have to take up what you believe in and get it done. I have done hundreds of them. I have never had consensus. And certainly not from those who benefit from those inefficiencies. If you thought that the telecom ministry agreed with me on those changes, you got to be kidding me. So somebody has to be, if you believe in the change, you have got to make it happen. You have to fight for it. No change would happen. Otherwise, it would have automatically happened. But in fact, no change will happen except for somebody who actually advocates it. So leadership matters. Yes.
Yeah.
It'll have to, yeah. Then after that, one more and then, yeah.
Yeah. So
Okay.
great insight. I think I wish there were more like you in the country. But the real problem, as you said, there are millions of such things that has to
Yes.
be done. How are we going to do it nationally? Maybe state level, municipal level, all levels, you know it well. The point I'm making is it's all problems. System is going to fight
Yes.
back. Administrative reforms, there are 18 volume report, nothing has happened, as you know very well, and we know the reasons why it has not. How are we going to make it happen?
So first of all,
what are
it
your
is-
thoughts
what-
there? I'm saying.
My thought is very simple. As is true for one process, it's also true for the system. That 80% of the problem lies in 20% of the process. We don't need to solve everything on earth. We need to decide where are the ones that you hit. And my experience is once the 80% gets solved, the last 20% solves itself. So let us not try and waste our time trying to solve every single process. Figure out which is the biggest holdup in the system. Let us say it is the KYC process for, I don't know, for SEBI. And he decides that this is the one thing to solve. Solve that. Just solve that one problem. You will be amazed how the rest of the system just becomes more efficient. So don't have to solve all problems. You just need to solve 20% of the problems. But to solve those 20% of the problems, you do need advocates to get up and begin solving them. And that requires a certain level of leadership on whoever it is who wants to do it. It can be done at every level. It can be done at the national level, which is where I am functioning. It can be done at the state level. It can be done at the municipal level. It can be done even in your RWA. You are not outsiders. That's the point I'm making to you. You are an insider in something. You will be an insider in NASSCOM. Yeah. There must be still some more garbage to be cleaned up in. So tell us what to do.
Yeah, we are trying doing that.
So bring them to me. Maybe that's what you can do, advocacy. You can do it at local level, where you live. There are many, many such things. The point I'm making is that you don't need to actually change too many things. Once a few things get changed, the rest of it clicks in place.
Yeah. Santosh Gharpure, professor in charge of science and in chemistry as well, professor. Great talk. What I felt is that we are trying to fix the thing after the fact, which is great, which is important. But can we also look at the same time, because we may not have crusaders like you who will be looking at the process reform all the time. But while drafting itself, it can be done better probably.
No, of course. It would be good to have, generally that's one of the things that in the drafting stage, we should always attempt for simplicity. One of the bizarre things, by the way, since you are engineers, you'll understand this. I'm a complexity theory guy. Okay, I don't believe in Newtonian systems. All of this is complex systems. And the point about complex systems is they are fluid. And those who deal with complex systems know one of the strange things about complex systems is that if you want to create a strange attractor, if you want it to behave in another way, you don't have to actually change the whole thing. You need to create a strange attractor to make it sort of tilt into that whirlpool wherever it is you want to go. So you don't actually have to change hundreds of people you just have to change a few things, and the swirling logic of that strange attractor will make the whole thing shift to a more efficient system. So that is the point I made. You don't need hundreds of people. A few people, look at Elon Musk, 2 weeks. Look at the amount of change he's been able to do. Because the system begins to shift itself to another ecosystem of logic. So once you are an inefficient ecosystem, when you shift some part of it, let's say that 20%, the rest of it begins to function on its own. So I don't think you need hundreds of people trying to do these changes. Keeping them a few simple changes, particularly ones that have significant impact, particularly multiplier effect, good enough.
Drafting is a more difficult problem.
No, so drafting is not always the thing. Do remember, I have a legacy system. It's all very good to say we're not beginning the Republic of India from nothing. Even when we did, we still had a legacy of a colonial government. So nothing that I am dealing with. Very rare occasions will I get a new sector that requires me to do something very new. Most of the time I'm dealing with a legacy system. So I don't have to really bother with this idea. Number one. Number two, even if it's a new sector and I did have good drafting, do remember it will get outdated after a while. So most of what we have is iterative systems. It's a complex systems with no beginning and no end. I am always somewhere in the middle. All the changes that I have made may have made it more efficient. 30 years from now, they may be considered inefficient for some other reason. So this is about continuous change. I do not have the luxury of this first draft except on very rare occasions. Like regulating AI, that may be a completely new area. But typically I'm dealing with a legacy system.
Okay, so thanks very much. Not very often we have advisory board members coming to these kind of talks. And it was a surprise to see Mr. Shashank Desai, who has been an advisory committee of a school in the IIT, on the pan IIT level. So I'll request Mr. Desai to hand over our token of appreciation and gratitude on the institute behalf to Mr. Sanyal. There are 2-3 things in it, so. So So you have understood that we have concluded the event. Thanks very much to the Institute Colloquium Committee, the director and the PRO office for organizing this. And those who are willing to take the signature of the book, depending on the availability of Mr. Sanyal, that's between the celebrity and the fan. So wish you all very best and a great evening ahead.